There is no such thing as monsters. That's what my mum used to say. She would tuck me in to bed, make sure that my favourite doll, Casey, was in my arms and tell me, "There's nothing to be scared of. There are no monsters. No real monsters." She would whisper these words to me mostly at night, because that's when the monsters like to come out. At night, when the walls would vibrate from machinery humming in the service tunnels and the submasons below. I needed to hear those words, when the wind would scream and howl from the unstable air currents and unpredictable weather patterns that came with an atmosphere being changed by a terraforming station. The turbines from filtration exchange towers took in the cold, alien atmosphere, expelled hot oxygen and nitrogen-rich air, just like the rhyme my daddy would sing to me. Bad air goes in, good air comes out. I would need reminding one more time when this giant atmospheric processing station brought the rain by releasing electrical discharges into the clouds. That was when the monsters scared me the most. The lightning and the thunder was the sound they made when they tried to get inside. The wind was the monster's voice, and the rain was its nails, clicking and tapping at the windows of my living quarters. My mummy would come in and make it all better and say, "There are no such thing as monsters." Monsters killed my mummy and daddy. Monsters are real, they were real, and they were here. The grown-ups promised they would keep us safe. They told us everything would be alright, and help us on its way. They lied. Our little settlement was so far away, it would take up to 2 weeks for the nearest outpost to reach us. The monsters were clever and patient. When there was only a few of them, they quietly picked off the families living in their habitat modules on the outskirts of the colony. The ones whose disappearance wouldn't be noticed right away. As their numbers increased, the monsters began to hunt in packs. It wasn't long before there was enough of them, and they didn't need to hide anymore. The monsters were coming. They were coming for each and every last one of us. The central air processing station was just outside the colony's perimeter. It was the primary terraformer and the control center for all the other automated terraforming substations that were spread across the small planet's surface. The majority of the grown-ups spent most of their waking hours here, including my mother. They were all doing their part to make this tiny world breathable. Building better worlds, like all the signs and videos say. The monsters crashed through the ceiling and tore through the floor, grating, catching everyone by surprise. Only a week ago, there was 158 of us. After the attack on the processing station, we had lost 84 people. Those of us left, gathered together for safety. We had to move quickly. We knew what the monsters did to you if they took you. We knew that for every one of us that was taken, the number of monsters would grow. We also knew we didn't have much time. The monsters grew so fast. We learned that from my daddy. He was the first. They thought I couldn't hear. They thought I wouldn't know. But I saw it all. When my daddy started screaming in pain, they took him to see the doctor. I followed them. The grown-ups may have ruled the corridors and hallways, but the kids owned the vents and the shafts. That was our playground. That was where we would play games like Monster Maze, and I was the best. The other kids were jealous because I could fit into places that others couldn't. They also couldn't memorize the turns and corners like me. I could go anywhere in this complex and never be seen. Not once. Finding my way to where they had taken my daddy was a breeze. I didn't have to rely on my memory of the winding and turning tunnels of the ventilation system to find the correct room. The screams echoed loud and clear. I followed the sounds to the grilled screen that would allow me to peer into the medical compartment. I made myself look, but in the end, I closed my eyes to the horror. The screams hurt my ears. He was in pain. A deep snap of bone startled everyone in the room, and my daddy grew quiet and still. Suddenly, I could hear his body thrash and convulse violently. The medical personnel tried to hold him down, but the convulsions were too strong. People gasped and screamed at the sound of a loud crunch and snaps, followed by what sounded like a bucket of water spilling into the ground and spraying all the walls. My father's screams were no more than just wet gurgles by now, and then I heard it. A loud and piercing screech came from something in the room, something that was angry, evil, and alien. It hissed loudly and scurried violently into the opposite direction, knocking over tools and equipment as it made its escape. The last of us gathered in the safest place left, the primary operations center. My daddy once told me that it was the very first building on the colony. The original settlers lived there back then when they couldn't breathe the air, and the operations center's thick walls and many pressurized doors protected them from the freezing temperatures and poisonous atmosphere. The adults put the kids into the center of the complex on the top level. They said the medical section was the safest place for us. We listened as the grown-ups did everything possible to block off entryways, weld shut each blast door, and close off every service tunnel. All access points were barricaded, and all the main entry gates were sealed shut. When all was said and done, there was nothing left to do but wait in the silence and fear the approach of nighttime, because everyone knows that the monsters mostly come out at night. Mostly. The planetoid rotates once every 57 hours. That makes for a very long night. Here, when the darkness falls, it feels like it will never end. The monsters didn't come the first night, or the second night, but they were there. Their large bodies pressed and slid against the outer bulkheads. Powerful talons scraped against the steel, and dueling jaws extended and clenched. A piercing shriek would call out and echo into the distance now and then. The monster's cries would startle us, causing screams of fright and tears from most of the children. We continued to wait. It started on the third day with a metallic thunk, thunk, thunk from the north gate. It echoed throughout the corridors. Anything not bolted down rattled and shook. I could see a relief wash over some of the adults' faces. The waiting was finally over. The beating at the massive door, 3 levels down, grew louder in intensity. The children were gathered together and hurriedly rushed into one of the unseen isolation medical bays, only used for storage. I didn't like this room. Even though it housed many rows of containers and equipment, there were no vents or shafts in here. There was no way to escape. We watched from the monitoring station that had been set up within the medical bay. The adults began readying themselves. Most had small handguns and chargers used for geological excavation. There was even a few crude flamethrowers. The strikes of the massive door became relentless. The poundings grew louder from massive blows now coming from the west gate. The monsters were slamming into the steel doors so hard and so fast, I could swear I felt the floor vibrate. They screamed with such anger from behind the barriers that blocked their way. The sounds and pounds and bangs became deafening. The claws and talons were now beating at the east gate. The echoes of metal being hit with massive, inhuman force now came at us from all directions, when impacts fell against the main, south gate. The bending and tearing of metal were heard throughout the complex, and shrieks of victory roared out from the aliens' lungs. We watched the blurry, dark shapes fill the monitor screens. Screams and hisses echoed from the lower levels as they tore down every barrier or obstacle. They filled the hallways, scurrying on the ceiling, wall, and the floor. They were coming for us. The monsters fell on the people defending our last and only defense, like a wall of black water. The grown-ups opened fire, tossed their explosives, and sprayed fire from the flamethrowers. Smoke filled the room, making it hard to see. Powerful arms shot out from the ceiling, and long fingers grabbed at anything within their reach. The monsters poured into the cramped space, slamming into the people. Screams of terror and breaking of bones could be heard over the speakers. Images of blood and flesh filled with our eyes from the small video monitors. Despite the wounds and injuries being inflicted, it was painfully obvious that none of the adults had been killed. Every last one of them was alive when they were dragged away into the darkness. It was over quickly. Soon, every last grown-up in operations was gone. Dangling legs lifted into the air vents disappeared. The monsters gathered around those who struggled or were capable of fending themselves off. They were cornered, and maimed by their teeth or claws. Hands or feet were torn and severed from the body. Obviously, it was easier to manage and carry off the prey if it was crippled. Screams of help and pleas for death slowly faded into the distance. The remaining grow-ups sealed the hatchway to the main access door of our section and stood between us and the approaching nightmares. They peeled away the hatch as if it was tinfoil, and we were at the viewports of the observation window that lined up the medical bay, hitting and scratching at the duraglass. They shattered it in no time, and began swarming into the medical bay. Gunshots rung loud, and screams from adults and children came from all directions. Monsters were leaping through the air, pouncing on any victim within their sight. They crawled on the walls and ceiling, plucking running children off their feet by their hair or even by their entire head from their large six-fingered claws. I cowered under an overturned medical bed when I locked eyes with a boy who couldn't have been more than 7. His arms were locked in a death grip around a support beam. 2 monsters pounced on him and began pulling him and jerking him violently. Somehow he maintained his grip around the metal beam and he would not let go. I screamed in horror when they broke his arms and pried him off that beam. His face had no expression or emotion. His limp arms trailed loosely behind him when they carried him away. He never screamed. Not once. A woman flew across the room, smashing into a large fume hood to the right and the rear of the large room. Her broken body lay over the destroyed workstation. The impact had toppled over the instrument and dislodged its upper panel, revealing its narrow ventilation duct within the wall. In a flash, I remembered the school day trip last month when to see the scientists. It was the same type of instrument, the one used for dangerous chemicals. It was a duraglass enclosure with 2 access openings for the hands. They would stick their hands through the access points and pour their chemicals from the inside, without breathing the fumes. The scientists said the fume were then removed from the complex by the exhaust fans. I got to my feet and dove for the tiny opening. 3 monsters, hunched on all fours, charged from the destroyed viewport. I entered the duct, only to discover it immediately went from ground level to a vent that went straight up the wall. I pressed my body as far as I could to avoid the claws that were reaching in for me. It pushed itself relentlessly into the small opening, wedging itself further into the duct. The slick coat of slime glistened on the claws that were inching closer. The tips of its nails were nicking my clothes. I could feel the pull of fabric grow firmer each time before the threads would break. I had one chance. I stood and placed one hand on each side of the vent, hopped off the ground, and pressed my feet against the walls to hold me up. I shimmied up the shaft bit by bit. Carefully, but as quick as I could manage. I had made it more than halfway up the duct's distance when the scraping and beating of claws filled my ears from below. When I lifted my head into the junction, I twisted myself in the opening and briefly my eyes fell on the monsters beneath me. I had never seen one this close. Its arm was extended and wedged under its massive head. The elongated head was cocked at an abnormal angle to face me. Transparent lips were quivering and curled over long and shiny fangs. Thick, clear drool poured out of its open mouth. It didn't even struggle anymore. It just looked at me. It had no eyes, but it still looked at me. A low and deep hiss began to build from within its chest until it was a piercing shriek. It was speaking to me. It was trying to tell me something. It was screaming it hated me. I turned from the shrieks of rage and quickly made my way into the ventilation system. It wasn't long before I knew exactly where I was. I disappeared into the network of duct shafts and pipes, the maze I knew so well. I had been all by myself for 2 weeks now. This tiny sub-compartment, cradled in an enlargement of pipes and support strut beams of the environmental control system, has become my home. The ventilation fan spins above me. The monsters keep their distance from its blades. The metal beams and large pipes keep me far out of reach from any monster's claws. I only leave my haven to scavenge for food. I avoid the main conduits in the ventilation system and stick to the smaller, secondary shafts where the monsters cannot fit. The monsters rule the corridors and hallways, but I own the vents and shafts. That is my playground. That is where I used to play games, like Monster Maze, and I was the best. The monsters are angry, because I can fit into places they can't. I have every turn and corner memorized. I can go anywhere in this complex and never be seen. Not once. The monsters can't see me. Monsters. My mother used to tell me there were no monsters. No real monsters. But there are.